Welcome to SnoozeCrime. Tonight we return to the hills around Florence, where couples kept disappearing into the dark for privacy, and where some of them never came back. For years, the crimes seemed to follow a pattern: a parked car, a quiet rural road, a place that felt hidden enough to be safe, and then gunfire. What made the Monster of Florence case so disturbing was not only the brutality, it was the uncertainty that followed it for decades. Investigators linked the murders through the same weapon. Suspects were named, arrests were made, trials followed, and still, the central question never fully went away. Did the investigation truly identify the killer behind one of Italy's most infamous murder series, or did it only come close? This is the story of a case built on recurring violence, missing certainty, and answers that never held as firmly as they seemed. This is SnoozeCrime. Real cases, told slowly. A woman was dead in the front seat of a parked car outside Florence. The man beside her was dead too, and in the back, still alive, was a sleeping child who had spent the night only a few feet from the gunfire. The question that would outlive almost everyone involved was not only who killed Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco on 21st August 1968. It was why that double murder, which first looked like a local scandal with an obvious domestic explanation, later became the opening chapter of one of Europe's most disturbing and disputed serial murder investigations. The place was Castelletti di Signa, west of Florence, in an area of fields and semi-rural roads where couples could disappear into privacy without traveling far from town. That geography would become one of the recurring facts of the wider case. The victims were not taken from busy city streets. They were found in those in-between places, close enough to civilization to feel accessible, but isolated enough for an attacker to work in darkness and leave before anyone understood what had happened. In August 1968, though, no one standing near that car could yet know that this pattern would echo across the Tuscan countryside for years. Barbara Lotti was 32 years old. Antonio Lobianco was 29. They had gone out together that night and were later found shot to death inside the vehicle. Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino Mele, had been in the car as well. He survived, not because the scene was safe, but because the child in the back seat was not the target, or not the target that night. The image has never lost its force. 2 adults murdered at close range, and a child left behind in the dark, alive among the bodies. That detail alone gave the case a strange shape from the beginning. A double homicide involving an adulterous relationship was one thing. Italy in the late 1960s had seen crimes of jealousy, family violence, and private vengeance before. But a child surviving in the back seat changed the moral and investigative temperature of the scene. It suggested either a killer with a narrow focus or a killer with enough control to decide exactly who would die and who would not. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Later, that same fact would look very different. The boy woke, realized something was wrong, and left the car. Accounts of the case agree on the broad fact that Natalino made his way to a nearby house after the shooting. That moment is one of the most haunting in the history of the Monster of Florence case because it contains in miniature the contradiction that would come to define the whole saga: terror in isolation, followed by an almost ordinary encounter with the outside world. The crime scene was secluded, but not impossibly remote. Help was close enough for a child to reach on foot. In the immediate aftermath, the murder did not arrive in public life as the work of a legendary unknown killer. It arrived as a local crime attached to real names, real relationships, and a very immediate circle of suspicion. Barbara Lotti's marriage was troubled, and her private life quickly became part of the case narrative. She was from Sardinia and had a reputation in the area that made her personal relationships central to early police thinking. That early framing mattered. Long before there was a Monster of Florence, there was a dead woman whose life could be dissected, a lover found beside her, and a husband who would soon become central to the investigation. That husband was Stefano Mele. In the first phase of the case, the logic was brutally simple. Barbara had been with another man. She and that man were found dead. Her husband had motive, proximity, and a life already entangled in the same emotional and social circle. Investigators treated the murders as something personal, something rooted in jealousy, betrayal, humiliation, or revenge. In other words, they treated it like a crime that could be contained. And for a time, the case did appear containable. Stefano Mele was convicted in connection with the 1968 double murder. Later sources summarizing the case note that he was sentenced in 1970 and spent years in prison. On paper, that should have been the end of the central mystery. A double murder had occurred. A husband had been held responsible. The violence had an explanation. The dead had names, and so did the killer. Cases are supposed to close that way. But even in that first phase, the certainty was unstable. Mele's statements shifted. Over time, he blamed others, including men connected to Barbara Lotti's circle. Those contradictions helped produce what later became known as the Sardinian Trail, a line of suspicion focused on relatives, lovers, and acquaintances from the victim's social world. That did not yet mean the investigation understood the truth. It meant only that the apparently obvious story was already showing cracks. A solved case should not need so many alternate versions. What made the 1968 murder so important was not just that it was violent. It was that the violence sat inside a confusing structure of relationships. Barbara Lotti's husband was one suspect. Her lovers created other possible lines of inquiry. The surviving child made the crime unforgettable, and the rural setting introduced an eerie physical template that would later become familiar. A parked car, darkness, distance from immediate witnesses, and a killer who had approached a moment of privacy and turned it into an execution site. None of that was enough in 1968 to create the legend, but the shape was already there. The weapon too would become central, though not all at once. The 1968 killings were committed with a .22 caliber handgun. Years later, investigators would say the same Beretta pistol linked the first double murder to the later series. That ballistic connection is one of the foundational facts of the Monster of Florence case, but it did not transform public understanding on the night of the crime. In August 1968, there was only a dead couple in a car and a child who had survived. The meaning of the weapon would come later, and when it came, it would reopen everything. That delayed meaning is part of what makes the case so unsettling. Many murder investigations move from confusion to clarity. This one moved, again and again, from apparent clarity back into confusion. The first murder was initially interpreted through intimate relationships and local grievance. Then later, evidence suggested it belonged to a much larger sequence. The result was not just a broader investigation, it was a retroactive collapse of certainty. A case that had once seemed morally legible became the first chapter of something far more obscure. In hindsight, the night of 21st August 1968 feels less like the beginning of a solved domestic crime than the opening move in a story investigators would spend decades trying to understand. But hindsight can be deceptive if it is allowed to flatten the confusion of the time. People at that first scene did not see a serial case. They saw a shocking double murder shaped by infidelity, a child survivor, and a web of personal scandal that seemed to offer motives close at hand. The horror came first. The pattern came later. There is another reason that First Crime remained so powerful in public memory. It introduced one of the deepest tensions in the entire Monster of Florence case: the distance between legal resolution and factual confidence. Stefano Mele's conviction gave the state an answer, but subsequent developments would strip that answer of its finality. By the time investigators concluded that the same gun was tied to later murders, the original case no longer looked settled. It looked contaminated by uncertainty, and once that happened, every early assumption had to be reconsidered. Even the number of crimes in the wider case would remain a matter of discussion in later years, because the 1968 murders sit at the edge of both linkage and dispute. Many summaries of the case include Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco as the first pair of victims in a series that ended in 1985. Some later reporting notes that debate has persisted around aspects of that linkage, even while the ballistic connection became a cornerstone of the standard account. That tension matters. The Monster of Florence case was never just about who did it. It was also about which facts could truly bear the weight placed on them. Still, one fact is beyond dispute. The night Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco were killed did not stay in 1968. It kept returning. It returned in police files, in courtrooms, in press coverage, in theories about husbands and lovers and accomplices, and later in the public mythology of a killer who seemed always to recede just beyond proof. The image of Natalino Mele wandering away from the car became, in effect, the first surviving witness image of the entire saga. A child emerging from darkness carrying a story no one yet knew how to read. And that is what made the first murder different from a routine homicide, even before anyone could explain why. The scene contained too many elements that refused to sit neatly together. There was intimacy, but also distance. There was a plausible suspect, but also instability in the story around him. There was a dead couple, but also a child spared. There was a gun, but no immediate understanding that the gun itself would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in modern Italian criminal history. It seemed small until it didn't. For years, the official and social meaning of that night would keep changing. What first looked like one ugly crime, tied to one damaged circle of relationships, would slowly become something else. A precursor, a warning, an unresolved origin point. The attack at Signa did not yet have a name like the Monster of Florence, but the foundations of that name were already present in the darkness around the car, in the child who survived, and in the fact that the answers available at the time would not hold. The case was supposed to end with the husband. Instead, it waited for the gun to speak again. By the time the first full response took shape, the murders already seemed to belong to two different stories at once. One was immediate and physical: a parked car near Signa, 2 adults shot to death inside it, and a 6-year-old boy who had wandered away from the scene and reached a nearby house. The other was social and interpretive: Barbara Lotti's private life, her marriage to Stefano Mele, her relationships with other men, and the speed with which the crime began to look less like a random attack than a killing rooted in a known circle of jealousy, humiliation, and grievance. In those first hours, police were not trying to solve a serial case. They were trying to understand a double homicide that appeared, on its surface, to have a contained human cause. Barbara Lotti was known in the area. Her relationship history was not a hidden detail waiting to be discovered months later. It was part of the case environment from the start. Antonio Lobianco, the man found dead beside her, was not her husband. That fact immediately narrowed attention toward the people already orbiting her life. The child survivor made everything more urgent and more strange. Natalino Mele had been in the back seat when the shots were fired. Accounts of the case agree that he later reached a nearby home after waking and realizing something was wrong. In practical terms, that meant investigators had something many murder scenes never provide in those first crucial hours: a living person who had been inside the immediate space of the attack. But he was also a small child, confronted with trauma that adults struggle to process. What he could say, how it would be interpreted, and how much weight it deserved would become delicate issues from the beginning. That is one of the first contradictions in the case. A child was present at the scene, yet the surviving witness did not simplify the investigation. He deepened it. The basic outline was horrifyingly clear. His mother and the man with her had been killed. But clarity at that level did not answer the important questions. Who had come to the car? How the killer had approached? Whether the attack had been planned in advance? Whether one person was responsible or more than one? And why the child had been left alive? The first police logic followed the relationships. That was not irrational. In a case involving a married woman found dead with another man, investigators had every reason to scrutinize the husband. Stefano Mele quickly moved into the center of the inquiry. Later summaries of the case describe him as eventually convicted for the 1968 murders, which reflects how powerful that early suspicion became. But before there was a conviction, there was the ordinary pressure of an initial homicide investigation. Who knew, who resented, who had reason to act, and who could place themselves outside the crime? At first, the structure seemed almost familiar. An affair, a husband, rural privacy, gunfire in the dark. Police across Europe had seen cases where an apparently spontaneous act of personal revenge turned lethal. This crime was more shocking than most because of the child in the back seat, but the emotional geometry was legible. It seemed to belong to a domestic world, even if that domestic world had spilled into a car parked off a quiet road. The possibility that this was something stranger had not yet become dominant. And yet the scene contained details that resisted easy explanation. A killer had approached a parked car in darkness and carried out a controlled attack. The victims were not dragged elsewhere. There was no confused public confrontation. Whatever happened, it happened in a setting chosen for privacy, where the victims were physically exposed and socially isolated. That mattered later because it would become one of the recurring features of the wider series. In the first hours, it was simply one more disturbing fact. The murderer had known where vulnerability lived. The attention on Stefano Mele intensified as investigators worked backward through the relationships around Barbara Lotti. This is where the case began to take on its more unstable form. Mele was not just a jealous husband in a simple triangle. Barbara Lotti's life connected multiple men, and those connections widened the range of suspicion. Some later reporting and case summaries described the early inquiry as moving into what became known as the Sardinian Trail, centered on Lotti's circle and on men from that same social background. But in the first stage, this was less a grand theory than a practical consequence of the victim's life. Too many names were close to the scene, and too many motives could be imagined. That widening effect was important. Cases that begin with apparent intimacy often narrow quickly. This one did not. Even when Stefano Mele emerged as the obvious suspect, the atmosphere around the case did not become clean. It became noisier. There were claims, reversals, accusations, and competing versions. Later accounts note that Mele's statements shifted over time and that he blamed other men before later taking responsibility himself. That instability did not erase suspicion against him. It made the foundation of the case less secure. In hindsight, one of the most disturbing facts is how early the investigation encountered ambiguity, and how readily that ambiguity could still be forced into a solvable framework. A husband whose wife was murdered with her lover was exactly the kind of suspect many investigators would expect to find. And once such a suspect exists, the rest of the case can begin to organize itself around him. Evidence is read toward him. Inconsistencies become signs of guilt rather than signs that the story itself may be incomplete. That was not proof of tunnel vision, but it created conditions in which tunnel vision could thrive. What the authorities knew for certain in those first hours was brutally limited. They had a double murder. They had a child survivor. They had a setting that suggested the victims had gone there for privacy. They had Barbara Lotti's marriage and personal relationships as an immediate field of inquiry. They had a firearm used at close range. What they did not have was any reason yet to think the weapon would one day matter more than the marriage. That last point is easy to miss, because later histories of the case are dominated by the .22 caliber Beretta and the ballistic link across years of killings. But the gun did not speak all at once. In 1968, it was still part of one crime scene. Its later significance had not yet emerged. The first investigators were not staring at the signature weapon of a future legend. They were staring at the instrument of a murder they believed might be explained by people already standing nearby in the social map of the victims' lives. The case also entered a public environment shaped by reputation. Barbara Lotti's name did not arrive in the press as a blank biography. She was discussed through the lens of her relationships, her marriage, and the judgments others had attached to her. That had two effects. It pulled the investigation toward the private and the local, and it made the murder legible to the public as something rooted in scandal. When a case is framed that way early, it becomes harder to imagine that it might belong to a broader pattern. Stefano Melle's path through the case would eventually reflect this confusion in full. He was convicted in connection with the murders, yet later developments would unravel the certainty of that outcome once the same gun was linked to later double killings. But in the first phase, the conviction still lay in the future. What existed first was interrogation, suspicion, and the slow shaping of a legal narrative in which the husband could be made to stand for the whole crime. And then there was the child. Natalino Mele's survival made the crime unforgettable, but it also left behind a silence at the heart of the case. He was present, but he could not provide the kind of adult reconstruction investigators always want. He could embody the horror better than anyone. He could not resolve it. That difference matters, because it helps explain why the early case moved so heavily toward adult motives and adult suspects. The most powerful witness to the crime was also the least able to stabilize the investigation. As police pushed through those first hours and into the first sustained phase of inquiry, the working assumption hardened. This was a personal crime. That assumption had force because it fit the social facts in front of them. But it also carried a hidden risk. If the murders were personal, then the answer was already nearby. If the answer was already nearby, then the wider shape of the crime might never be sought. And if the wrong nearby answer took hold, the real meaning of the case could stay buried for years. That was the danger sitting inside the investigation almost from the start. Not incompetence in the crude sense, not a lack of suspects. The problem was the opposite. There were too many plausible human stories crowding the case. A betrayed husband, a lover, a feud inside Barbara Lotti's circle, a cluster of Sardinian connections. Each offered a narrative strong enough to occupy police attention. None yet required anyone to ask whether the attack belonged to something that extended beyond one night near Signa. Later, when the same weapon surfaced in later murders, everything about those first hours would change meaning. But at the time, no one had that advantage. The investigators had only the crime in front of them, the names closest to the victims, and a child walking out of darkness into someone else's doorway. In practical terms, the first response did what first responses often do. It looked for the nearest reason, and the nearest reason was Stefano Mele. That was not the end of the story, it was the first version of it. For several years after the 1968 murders of Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco, the case had the outward shape of a crime that belonged to one damaged circle of relationships. Stefano Mele had been convicted. Barbara's private life had supplied investigators with motive, scandal, and a locally intelligible explanation. Even if that explanation was unstable, it still allowed the killings to be treated as something that had happened once. Then, in September 1974, another young couple was found murdered near Borgo San Lorenzo. And once that second crime entered the record, the first case began to lose its boundaries. The victims in that 1974 attack were Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, a teenage couple who had gone out for the evening and ended up dead in an isolated area near Rabata, close to Borgo San Lorenzo. The case was brutal enough on its own to demand national attention. Both had been shot, and Pettini's body showed extreme post-mortem violence. Even allowing for the need to handle such details with restraint, investigators could see that this was not an ordinary lover's quarrel or a robbery gone wrong. The physical structure of the attack suggested control, persistence, and a level of aggression that was not easy to fit inside a simple personal motive. At first, though, the wider meaning still did not fully land. One reason was timing. 6 years had passed since the Signa killings. That gap made it easier to see the 1974 murders as their own terrible event, rather than the continuation of a single design. Another reason was that investigators still did not publicly possess the one fact that would later reorganize everything: the conclusion that the same .22 caliber Beretta had been used in both cases. Without that ballistic bridge, there was horror, but not yet a series, yet. Even so, the 1974 crime changed the emotional temperature around the case. The victims were young. They had been in a private place, away from the pressure of family and public scrutiny, doing what countless couples do when they believe they have found a quiet corner of the night. The attack converted that ordinary search for privacy into something else. It suggested that the danger was not in a domestic interior or a known feud, but out in the countryside itself. That shift would become one of the defining features of the Monster of Florence murders. Later accounts of the 1974 killings preserved small details that made the crime feel even more unsettling. Reports summarized in case histories described Pettini having told a friend that a strange man had frightened her shortly before the murder, and other recollections placed suspicious men or voyeurs around the area where couples parked. Those details are not the same as proof. They did not identify a killer, but they mattered because they introduced a new atmosphere around the case. The violence no longer sat only inside the known social circle of Barbara Lotti. It now seemed to hover around the very spaces where young couples sought seclusion. The public still did not yet have the fully formed monster, but a new pattern was beginning to become imaginable. There was now more than one double homicide. There was now more than one rural lover's lane or roadside setting. There was now more than one case in which the physical vulnerability of a parked couple had been exploited with deadly precision. A crime that had once looked like a local scandal was becoming harder to contain inside local scandal alone. Then came another long silence. That silence is one of the strangest parts of the case. In retrospect, people often remember the Monster of Florence as a continuous reign of terror. It was not. It came in intervals, with long stretches in which the killer seemed absent, imprisoned, dead, or simply inactive. The effect was destabilizing. Every new attack had to compete with the human wish to believe the last one had been exceptional. When years passed, that wish grew stronger. And then in June 1981, it collapsed again. On 6 June 1981, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio were murdered near Scandicci. They were engaged, they lived in the area, and they had gone to an isolated place expecting privacy. Instead, they were attacked in a way that immediately revived the worst features of the earlier crimes: gunfire, close-range violence, and the use of a secluded site that gave the attacker control over time and space. By then, the possibility of a recurring offender was no longer an abstract fear. It was becoming difficult to deny. This 1981 murder was historically important because it marked the beginning of the final and most feared phase of the series. Once the killings resumed after the long gap, they no longer sat at the edges of memory. They arrived in an Italy with more developed media culture, more public discussion of serial crimes, and a growing sense that something abnormal was moving through the Florentine countryside. The old explanations were starting to fail. If the 1968 killings belonged only to Barbara Locci's marriage, why did another couple die in 1974? If 1974 had been its own isolated atrocity, why were Foggi and Denuccio now dead in 1981? And the case did not wait long before growing again. On 22 October 1981, only months after the Scandicci murders, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi were killed near Calenzano. The interval mattered. A single attack can be folded into almost any explanation. 2 in 1 year are harder to domesticate. By the time Baldi and Cambi were dead, the public and investigators were no longer looking at scattered tragedies. They were looking at recurrence. The geography varied, the victims changed, but the logic of approach remained horribly familiar. An isolated couple, a dark road or secluded ground, a sudden eruption of gunfire and close physical violence. This is the stage where a case begins to take on a public life larger than the facts immediately available. Newspapers and crime reporting did not invent the murders, but they gave them a collective identity. The name Monster of Florence, or related labels like the Maniac of Couples, belongs to that process of public framing. A series becomes more than a sequence of files when people start to imagine a single will behind it, moving from place to place through recognizable method. Once that happened, fear spread beyond the victims' families. It entered ordinary behavior. Couples became more conscious of where they parked, how exposed they were, and what it meant to be alone outside the city after dark. That public growth also changed the pressure on police. A murder that can be solved through one suspect line allows for patience. A murder series attached to a growing nickname does not. Each new killing rewrote the meaning of the earlier ones. Investigators were no longer just solving a present crime. They were being asked to prove that the past had been correctly understood. That is part of why the eventual ballistic linkage mattered so much. Once police concluded that the same .22 caliber weapon connected the attacks, the earlier conviction of Stefano Mele could no longer function as a satisfying endpoint. It became the beginning of a larger problem. The breakthrough in understanding came into focus in 1982, after the murders of Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini near Baccagliano. Later summaries of the case described that year as the point when investigators formally connected the 1968 Lo Bianco Locci murders to the later series through a re-examination of shell casings and projectiles, concluding that the same type of .22 caliber Beretta and Winchester H-series ammunition had been involved. That was the moment when the case truly grew beyond its earlier limits. It was not simply that another couple had died. It was that a murder once treated as domestic and local was now tied to a sequence stretching across 14 years. The effect of that connection was enormous. It did not just add one more crime to the series, it destabilized the legal and investigative record that had come before. Stefano Mele had been convicted in the 1968 case, but he had been imprisoned during later murders, That meant the weapon linkage did not clarify the story so much as explode it. Investigators were pushed back toward the old Sardinian circle around Barbara Locci, toward Francesco Vinci and others associated with that earlier world, because the original domestic explanation no longer seemed large enough. The case was expanding across time, across suspects, and across theories all at once. This is why Chapter 3 in the story of the Monster of Florence is less about one clue than about scale. The case grew because each murder changed the meaning of the previous one. The 1974 killings made 1968 harder to forget. The 1981 murders made 1974 harder to isolate. The 1982 ballistic connection turned all of them into one problem, and that problem no longer belonged only to families, lovers, or one local district. It belonged to Tuscany, to the Italian press, and to a criminal justice system under intensifying public pressure. It also became more psychologically disturbing because the victims did not fit the old personal model. Foggy and Denuccio were not part of Barbara Locci's world. Baldi and Cambi were not extensions of the Signa scandal. These were different couples in different places, linked not by their private histories, but by what they were doing when they died. They were together. They were alone. They had chosen a space of privacy. That was enough. In serial crime, that kind of victim selection is often the moment when a community realizes the killer is not solving a grievance. He is repeating a method. And yet even here the case refused to become simple. The Monster of Florence was never a textbook serial investigation with one clean suspect line. Almost as soon as the series took public shape, competing explanations multiplied. Was the killer one man or more than one? Did the first case truly belong? Were the mutilations signature behavior or evidence of something more complicated? Was the answer hidden in Barbara Locci's earlier circle, or had the investigation only been dragged there because of the first crime's domestic surface? Every attempt to make the story clearer seemed to produce another layer of dispute. Still, by the early 1980s, one fact could no longer be pushed aside. Whatever else the police did not know, the countryside around Florence was now the setting of a linked series of double murders. The public had a name for the killer. The press had a structure for telling the story. Investigators had a weapon line that tied years together, and ordinary people had begun to understand that a place associated with romance and privacy had become the hunting ground of someone who returned, waited, and knew exactly when a couple would be most defenseless. That was the development that changed how the case was understood. It was no longer the story of one terrible night near Signa, or even two terrible nights separated by years. It was now a sequence, and sequences demand a pattern. By the early 1980s, the Monster of Florence investigation had become a public story about dead couples, a .22 caliber Beretta, and a killer who seemed to appear, vanish, and then return. But the more disturbing part of the case was what had been happening outside public understanding for years. The murders did not just repeat, they repeated with a method. The killer, or killers, seemed to know where couples went for privacy, how little protection those places offered, and how quickly a private night could be turned into an ambush. The hidden life of the case was not only the life of a suspect moving through Tuscany, it was the life of a pattern that existed before investigators fully understood it. That pattern began with site selection. The attacks generally happened in rural or semi-rural areas around Florence, dirt roads, wooded margins, fields, and parking spots, known locally as places where couples could stop without being immediately observed. These were not random urban encounters, they were moments of chosen isolation. That fact matters because it suggests a predator who understood social behavior as much as geography. He did not need to lure victims, He only needed to know where vulnerability would already be waiting for him. In serial crime, method often becomes visible only after several scenes are placed side by side. That is exactly what happened here. Looked at one by one, the murders could still be forced into local explanations, but looked at together, they began to show a disciplined structure. A couple goes out at night. They seek privacy. They park in a secluded place. The attacker arrives with a firearm already suited to close work in darkness. He uses surprise to seize control almost instantly. And after the first shots, the crime does not end there. That recurrence was one of the reasons the case grew more frightening with each new killing. The violence did not look impulsive. It looked practiced. The countryside itself became part of the offender's method. The hills and roads around Florence are beautiful, but beauty has nothing to do with safety. In the monster case, the landscape functioned as concealment. Lovers' lanes and wooded pull-offs gave victims the privacy they wanted, but they also gave the attacker darkness, approach routes, and time. A murderer operating in a crowded city center risks interruption. A murderer operating at the edge of fields and woods can choose when to come close, when to strike, and when to disappear. The hidden life of the case was built into those spaces long before the public learned to fear them. What investigators had not yet fully understood was that the crime scenes were not only places where people died, they were places where the offender's confidence could be measured. The monster attacks generally showed no sign of chaotic struggle spreading far beyond the immediate area of the victim's vehicle or campsite. That does not mean the crimes were simple. It means the offender appeared able to impose control quickly. He was not experimenting with random violence in public view. He was approaching situations in which surprise did most of the work for him. In hindsight, that became one of the most disturbing details in the case. The murders also developed a recurring forensic identity. Investigators tied the core series together through ballistic evidence involving a .22 caliber Beretta pistol and the same ammunition family. That linkage mattered not just because it connected crimes, it revealed continuity beneath long gaps. A murder in 1968 did not stay buried in its own domestic explanation once the same weapon was associated with later attacks. The gun turned separate scenes into a sequence, and the sequence revealed a hidden continuity that had existed even while police and the public were still thinking in fragments. The gaps between murders made the pattern harder to read. There was a 6-year interval between 1968 and 1974, and then another long silence before the killings resumed in 1981. Those intervals did not make the case less dangerous. They made it harder to understand. A killer who strikes every few weeks produces one kind of investigative picture. A killer who disappears for years produces another. Each long gap invited false closure. Each return destroyed it. That rhythm is part of what gave the monster case its uniquely destabilizing quality. Even when nothing happened, the earlier crimes were not truly over. They were only waiting to be redefined by the next one. By the time the murders resumed in 1981, what had once looked like isolated brutality was beginning to look like offender behavior. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela De Nuccio were killed near Scandicci in June 1981. Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi were murdered near Calenzano in October of the same year. Then came Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini in 1982. Whatever remained uncertain about motive or offender count, the repeated structure of the crimes was no longer easy to dismiss. The victims were changing. The setting and method were not. This is where the hidden life of the case becomes especially important. Publicly, the monster was becoming a feared name. Privately, investigators were confronting the possibility that the killer had been moving through these environments for years with a level of local knowledge that could not be reduced to a momentary impulse. He seemed to know where couples would be. He seemed to know how to approach them at night, and he seemed to know how to leave without leaving behind the one thing the case never recovered, the murder weapon itself. The missing Beretta became one of the most important absences in the entire investigation. The offender's relationship to the victims was also hidden in a crucial way. In many homicide investigations, the central question is, who knew whom? In the Monster case, the more relevant question became, who did not need to know the victims at all? The couples were generally linked not by social overlap, but by circumstance. They were young or relatively young adults alone in private settings, often in cars, sometimes in places familiar to local patterns of courtship and secrecy. The killer appears to have selected a situation rather than a personal grievance. That distinction pushed the case away from ordinary revenge and toward predation. There were also signs, scattered through later summaries and reporting, that some victims had sensed something before the murders. Accounts tied to the 1974 murders of Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini include references to her having been disturbed by a strange man in the period before the crime. Reports surrounding later attacks likewise mention suspicious presences, men watching, or the sense that a couple had been noticed. These details do not identify the offender, and they have to be handled carefully. But together they suggest a hidden pre-attack life to the case: observation, movement, waiting, and perhaps surveillance, so ordinary it did not register as danger until it was too late. That is one reason the Monster of Florence remained so psychologically powerful. The crimes did not depend on elaborate abduction or prolonged access to a victim's life. They depended on a basic social truth. People alone at night often assume that privacy is safety. The hidden logic of the case was the opposite. Privacy was the thing being hunted. The attacker turned lovers' seclusion into vulnerability, and he did it often enough that the pattern eventually became unmistakable. The murders of Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch in 1983 added another disturbing layer. The two West German men were killed near Giogoli in a crime later included in the core series. Because one victim had long blonde hair, investigators considered whether the killer had initially believed he was targeting a male-female couple. That interpretation has circulated widely in case summaries. If true, it would imply that the offender's target category mattered more than the specific identities of the people inside the vehicle. Even if treated cautiously, the possibility reveals something important. The selection process may have begun from visual cues and setting, rather than intimate knowledge. Then came the 1984 murders of Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini near Vicchio, and finally the 7 to 8 September 1985 murders of Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Morio near Scopeti. By that last crime, the series had become one of the most notorious in Italy. The 1985 attack also expanded the hidden life of the case in another way. Cravechvili and Moriot were French, and because they were not local, there was initially no immediate missing persons framework around them. The bodies were found only later, and soon afterward an anonymous envelope containing part of the victim's remains was sent to the Florence prosecutor's office. That act was not just cruelty, it was communication. The offender, if he sent it, was not only killing, he was asserting authorship. By then, the hidden pattern had surfaced almost completely, but the hidden offender had not. Police could describe the recurring use of a .22 caliber Beretta. They could map the geography. They could compare victim types, timing, and site characteristics. They could reconstruct the sequence of attacks across 17 years. But they still could not answer the most important question with certainty. Was the offender one man, multiple men, or a small group? The crimes suggested coherence. The investigation never fully resolved what kind of human arrangement produced that coherence. That uncertainty shaped the suspect theories that followed. The earlier Sardinian line tied to Barbara Locci's circle survived because the first crime remained foundational and because Stefano Mele could not have committed the later murders while imprisoned. But the more the case grew, the less that theory could fully explain the serial structure. At the same time, later prosecutions involving Pietro Pacciani, Mario Vanni, and Giancarlo Lotti would never erase broader doubt about whether the complete truth had been reached. The hidden life of the case kept resisting final ownership by any single explanation. One of the most telling facts is that even after years of murder, publicity, and intense inquiry, the killer's practical method still seemed to work. He kept finding couples in private places. He kept exploiting darkness and distance. He kept using a weapon that linked scenes without ever being recovered. That was not just a forensic problem. It was a lesson in how much of serious violence can live just beneath ordinary behavior, hidden not because it is invisible, but because no one yet knows how to connect what they are seeing. The truth was never wholly buried underground in some secret room of evidence. Much of it was in plain sight from the beginning. The places couples chose, the recurring use of privacy, the weapon, the repeated control, the return to the countryside, the long silences followed by sudden violence. The hidden life of the case was hidden mainly because it was dispersed across years, districts, and separate files. Once those pieces were assembled, the pattern looked unmistakable. But even then, pattern was not the same as identification. The investigators were closer to understanding the offender's method than they were to understanding the offender himself. And for a time, that difference was enough to keep the killings going. By the time the Monster of Florence investigation entered the 1990s, the case had already consumed decades, multiple suspect lines, and a level of public fear rare in modern Italian criminal history. The murders had stopped after the 1985 killings near Scopiti, but silence did not bring certainty. It did something worse. It created room for investigators, magistrates, journalists, and the public to keep circling the same question with no stable answer. Then one man began to draw that attention toward himself more strongly than anyone before him, Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani did not become important because he was caught in the act. He became important because after years of pressure, he seemed to offer something the investigation had never fully possessed. A figure who looked as though he could hold the contradictions of the case inside one body. He was a Tuscan farm worker from the countryside. He had a violent history. He lived in the same broad rural world through which the murders had moved. And once police and prosecutors focused on him, earlier fragments of the case began to be reread around his presence. At first it looked like progress. Later, that same turn would become one of the most disputed phases of the entire investigation. Part of what made Pacciani so compelling to investigators was that he did not fit the image many people had unconsciously carried for years. Serial killers in the public imagination are often imagined as organized, elusive, cold, almost theatrical in their intelligence. Pacciani was not presented that way. He was coarse, rural, already notorious for other violence, and easy for the press to turn into a physical symbol of the monster. That mattered because the Monster of Florence case had always carried a split between forensic pattern and public mythology. Pacciani gave the mythology a face. His past was deeply damaging. Pacciani had previously been convicted in a separate homicide years earlier, having killed his fiancée's lover in 1951. That fact alone did not prove anything about the monster murders, but it made him legible to police and to the public in a very specific way, as a man already capable of extreme violence, humiliation, and sexualized rage. In a case shaped by attacks on couples in private spaces, That history made people uneasy. The problem was not only that he had killed before, it was that he seemed to fit a social and psychological silhouette investigators had long been trying to complete. And then there was the setting of his life. Pacciani belonged to the Tuscan rural world in which the murders had unfolded. This mattered because the monster case had always implied local knowledge. The killer seemed to understand roads, lovers' lanes, and isolated spots where couples went at night. He seemed to know how long he could remain at a scene and how to leave without drawing immediate attention. A suspect from outside, that geography would have raised one set of questions. Pacciani raised fewer of them. He looked like someone who could move through that terrain without seeming out of place. That was not proof, but it increased suspicion. Once he emerged as a major suspect, earlier moments in the case began to change shape in hindsight. That often happens in long investigations. Small details that once seemed disconnected are suddenly gathered into one narrative and made to point toward a central figure. In Pacciani's case, searches, testimonies, and interpretations of physical evidence were increasingly arranged around the idea that the investigation had finally found the monster, or at least the core of him. What had been years of fragmentation started to harden into a prosecutorial story. That story did not depend on one single decisive forensic breakthrough. In fact, one of the lasting criticisms of the Pacciani case is that it never produced the kind of conclusive physical evidence that would silence doubt. The murder weapon was still missing. There was no clean forensic chain tying him to all the crime scenes in a way that ended debate. Instead, the case against him built through accumulation, his violent past, his character, the interpretation of items found during searches, witness accounts, and the belief that his life and behavior matched the crimes closely enough to explain them. That is exactly why he remains such a dangerous figure in the history of the case. Not dangerous only because of what he may or may not have done, but because of what he represented to a desperate investigation. After years of public pressure, an investigation can begin to crave narrative closure as much as legal closure. Pacciani offered both the possibility of guilt and the shape of guilt. He looked to many like someone who could anchor the story at last. And when a suspect appears to solve too many narrative problems at once, the risk of overcommitment rises. In 1993, Pacciani was arrested as the alleged Monster of Florence. That arrest was one of the biggest turning points in the case because it signaled that investigators were no longer merely juggling theories. They were naming a man. Publicly and institutionally, that changed everything. The monster was no longer only a phantom in the countryside or a forensic continuity carried by a missing Beretta. He was now attached to a living suspect with a face, a biography, and a courtroom future. The prosecution's construction of Pacciani also benefited from something subtler. His very roughness made him easier to believe in. He was not polished. He was not sympathetic. He did not carry the kind of public presentation that naturally generates caution or empathy. That mattered in a media-heavy case. A suspect who is already easy to fear is easier to narrate as the answer. It is one thing for evidence to be persuasive. It is another for a suspect's appearance, manner, and past to do persuasive work before the evidence is even fully examined. Yet even as suspicion intensified, the contradictions never disappeared. One of the central problems in the monster case had always been whether one offender was enough to explain the crimes. Some investigators and later commentators argued that the murders suggested more than one person, whether through accomplice support, multiple offenders, or a small group structure. Pacciani's emergence did not erase that uncertainty. In some ways, it sharpened it. If he was the monster, was he the only monster? If he was not alone, who else was present? And if the broader pattern involved more than one man, then identifying Pacciani might solve only part of the story. This is where Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti begin to move closer to the center, though not yet fully. Their names became more prominent as the case around Pacciani developed, especially later when Lotti gave statements implicating himself and others, and both men were convicted in proceedings tied to several of the murders. But in the phase where Pacciani first became central, what mattered was not yet the final trio of names. What mattered was that the investigation had found a man around whom other suspicious connections could start to gather. That gathering effect is one of the most important structural shifts in the case. Earlier theories had radiated outward from Barbara Locci, Stefano Mele, and the Sardinian Trail. The Pacciani phase did something different. It pulled the case into a new center of gravity, one based less on the first murder's personal web and more on the idea of a recurring local predator or group moving through the Tuscan countryside. This did not eliminate the earlier lines, but it reframed them. The investigation was no longer asking only who in Barbara Locci's circle might explain 1968. It was asking who, in the decades that followed, could embody the wider series. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted in the first instance trial and sentenced to life imprisonment. On the surface, this looked like the long-awaited break in one of Italy's darkest cases. A man had been arrested, tried, and found guilty. After all the years of terror, all the lovers' lanes, all the dead couples and failed suspect trails, the state had finally declared that it knew who the monster was. That moment is crucial to understand because it shows how close the case came to formal closure. For many people, this was the answer. But the confidence did not hold. On appeal in 1996, Pacciani was acquitted. The Attorney General himself argued for acquittal, citing lack of evidence and poor police work. That reversal did not merely soften the case against him, it changed its meaning. A man once declared the monster by a trial court was now no longer legally established as such, and the investigation's authority suffered accordingly. In hindsight, that became one of the most disturbing details in the case. The person who had seemed to fit so well no longer fit securely enough to stand. Italy's High Court later ordered a new trial, but Pacciani died in 1998 before that process could be completed. That death sealed the ambiguity around him. He was neither finally exonerated in the public imagination nor finally confirmed through a completed retrial. He remained suspended between conviction and collapse, central to the case but not definitive within it. Few suspects in modern European criminal history occupy such a structurally unstable place. And that is why Pietro Pacciani is the person who did not fit. He did not fit because he fit too well. He seemed for a time to gather the whole case into himself. He had the violence, the geography, the notoriety, and the symbolic force investigators and the public had been waiting for. But the deeper the legal process went, the less complete that fit became. The case could be built around him. It could not be closed around him with certainty. Later, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti would move from the edges of suspicion toward convictions in connection with several murders. Their names would complicate Pacciani's role rather than resolve it. If they were involved, then Pacciani might have been part of something larger. If their convictions were themselves contested, then the larger case might still be resting on unstable ground. The story was not becoming simpler. It was becoming more crowded. By the end of the Pacciani phase, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The investigation had finally identified a man it believed could be the Monster of Florence, but the legal and evidentiary structure around that belief was already cracking. The suspect who looked like the answer had become the source of a new uncertainty. And once that happened, every person standing near him started to look different too. The most maddening aspect of the Monster of Florence case was not that the killer left no pattern. It was that the pattern was there for years. Couples were attacked in isolated areas around Florence. The same .22 caliber Beretta was repeatedly linked to the core series. The crimes generally unfolded in places chosen for privacy, with the attacker exploiting darkness, distance, and surprise. The problem was not the absence of recurring facts. The problem was that those facts did not produce a single convincing human answer. By the time investigators were deep into the 1980s, a number of crucial features were already visible. The victims were generally couples in cars or otherwise alone in secluded settings. The killer appeared to know where such couples went and how exposed they would be once they settled into those spaces. The same firearm line tied the murders together across years, yet the weapon itself was never recovered. That combination should have narrowed the search conceptually. Instead, it widened uncertainty. Police could describe the behavior, but describing behavior is not the same as naming the person behind it. One thing hidden in plain sight was the role of ordinary geography. The murders did not happen in abstract crime scenes. They happened in real places around Florence that were familiar to local habits of courtship, secrecy, and nighttime movement. That meant the offender may not have needed elaborate preparation for each crime. He only needed to understand what other people already did. Privacy did the work of victim selection for him. The countryside gave him the stage. This matters because it reframes the killer's intelligence. He did not need to be a criminal genius in the cinematic sense. He needed to be locally legible and tactically patient. A man who knows where couples park, what roads remain quiet, and how quickly he can enter and leave a semi-rural site has an enormous advantage. In that sense, the Monster's method was hidden in plain sight because it was built from normal social behavior rather than exotic criminal innovation. Another fact that remained visible but unresolved was the tension between one killer and more than one. The case record and later commentary never fully settled whether the murders were committed by a lone offender, by accomplices, or by a small group. That uncertainty was not some decorative mystery added later by journalists. It was built into the investigation itself. Even the final convictions involving Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti did not end broader public and legal debate over whether the complete truth had been established. That ambiguity affected everything. If one man committed all the crimes, then the long pattern reflected consistency, control, and the ability to move undetected for years. If more than one man was involved, then the case was hiding cooperation in plain sight. Either way, something crucial had remained visible without becoming fully recognized. The repetition was obvious. The structure behind the repetition was not. The earlier Sardinian line is one of the clearest examples of this problem. Once investigators connected the 1968 murders of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco to the later series through the weapon, the old domestic explanation could no longer hold on its own. Stefano Mele had been convicted in the first case, yet he could not account for later murders while in prison. That pushed attention back toward Locci's wider circle and men such as Francesco Vinci. But even that shift did not solve the central contradiction. The first case might have contained a local personal history, yet the later series suggested something broader and more methodical. Both things could be true in part, and that made the case harder, not easier. It is tempting to think that once a ballistic link is found, the path ahead becomes straightforward. In reality, the Beretta connection acted more like a pressure multiplier. It proved continuity between scenes, but it also destabilized earlier certainties. A solved murder became unsolved in context. A convicted husband became part of a larger unresolved chain. Suspect pools expanded rather than contracted. The weapon clarified the pattern while muddying the identity. And then there was the weapon's absence. The Beretta was central to the case, but it was never recovered. That missing object became one of the most important silent facts in the investigation. Without it, police could not close off alternative theories as decisively as they wanted. Without it, later prosecutions had to rely more heavily on witness statements, suspect histories, circumstantial interpretations, and reconstructions of behavior. In a case already burdened by years of fear and media pressure, that missing gun left a permanent evidentiary hole. The public often imagines investigative failure as missing one dramatic clue. The Monster case suggests something else. Sometimes the more dangerous failure is seeing too much and arranging it badly. Investigators were not blind to recurrence. They knew the sites were similar. They knew the couples were similarly vulnerable. They knew the .22 caliber weapon linked the core crimes. But turning recurring facts into a coherent theory of offender identity proved far more difficult than recognizing the recurring facts themselves. This is where Pietro Pacciani's later emergence becomes easier to understand. When a case produces years of visible pattern without visible resolution, the first suspect who seems capable of absorbing that pattern can become overwhelmingly attractive. Pacciani was local, violent, already associated with other serious crimes, easy to imagine moving through the same rural environment. He looked, to investigators and to much of the public, like someone who could turn the long visible pattern into a single comprehensible human source. But the appeal of that fit was also its danger. The later collapse of certainty around Pacciani revealed how much had remained unresolved beneath the apparent breakthrough. He was convicted in 1994 and acquitted on appeal in 1996, with a new trial ordered before his death in 1998. That sequence did not merely show legal back and forth, it exposed how fragile the underlying structure of proof was. The pattern had always been visible, the attribution had not. Once Pacciani became central, other men around him also began to look different. Vanni, a postman, and Giancarlo Lotti, a local man whose later statements became pivotal, were drawn into the case as alleged accomplices. Their eventual convictions in final instance in 2000 for multiple murders seemed, at least formally, to offer a group explanation. But even that official result did not erase criticism, especially because the convictions relied heavily on contested testimony and did not resolve the broader missing forensics problem. Hidden in plain sight again was the difference between a legally sustainable story and a universally convincing one. Lotti's role is especially important here. His statements implicated himself and others, and they became central to the prosecutions involving Vanni and the wider theory around Pacciani. But the reliability and legal meaning of those statements have been debated ever since. That debate is not incidental. It goes to the heart of why the case still feels unresolved. If a major part of the explanation depends on testimony that many observers consider unstable, then the official narrative remains exposed even after conviction. The same is true of broader theories that later circulated around occult motives, secret networks, or commissioned mutilations. Those ideas became part of the public mythology of the case, but they were never objectively confirmed in a way that resolved the murders. Their persistence says less about proven fact than about the vacuum created when a series is partially explained and never fully closed. In such cases, speculation thrives because certainty never entirely arrives. What remained visible throughout all of this was behavior. The offender, whether one man or more, targeted moments of privacy. He returned to rural and semi-rural environments. He used a recurring ballistic signature. He displayed enough consistency to link murders across 17 years. Those features were not buried. They were sitting on the surface of the file, but behavior, however clear, cannot testify to motive, and it cannot by itself tell investigators whether they are hunting a solitary predator, a dominant leader with helpers, or a loose collaborative arrangement. This is why the case remained so difficult to solve cleanly. The visible facts supported several incompatible human stories: a lone, organized killer, a cluster of local offenders, an initial domestic murder later absorbed into a larger series, a partial solution that caught some of the perpetrators but not all. Each version could point to pieces of the same record. None removed every contradiction. And that is the real meaning of hidden in plain sight in the Monster of Florence case. The missed thing was not a footprint or a single forgotten witness. It was the difficulty of interpreting a pattern that everybody could see. The crimes were visible. The links were visible. The vulnerability of the victims was visible. Even the limits of the evidence were visible. What remained hidden was the one conclusion strong enough to hold all of it together. By the early 1990s, investigators believed they were finally closing in. They had a suspect who seemed to fit the geography and the violence. They had men around him who might explain the accomplice problem. They had years of public fear pushing them toward a decisive answer. For the first time in decades, it looked as though discovery was no longer theoretical. It looked near. For years, the Monster of Florence case had advanced in fragments. There were dead couples, a recurring ballistic signature, long gaps between attacks, and a public imagination filled with fear, but not certainty. Then, in the early 1990s, the investigation finally entered the phase every long unsolved case is supposed to reach. Police stopped speaking mainly in patterns and began speaking in names. The breakthrough was not the recovery of the murder weapon. It was not a confession that settled everything. It was the moment prosecutors believed they had finally found the man who could stand at the center of the whole series, Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani's importance came from convergence. He was not a stranger pulled from nowhere. He was a Tuscan farm laborer with a violent past, including a prior homicide conviction, and he lived inside the same broad rural world through which the monster murders had moved for years. To investigators, that mattered. The monster case had always suggested local familiarity, knowledge of roads, hidden parking areas, and the rhythms of private nighttime behavior in the countryside around Florence. Pacciani looked like someone who could belong to that environment without drawing attention. The anti-monster investigation under police leadership intensified around him as officers and prosecutors tried to turn decades of circumstantial suspicion into a coherent theory. By this point, the public was primed for a decisive answer. The killings had ended after 1985, but the silence had not reduced pressure. It had increased it. Every year without resolution made the earlier crimes more legendary and more intolerable. A suspect who seemed to fit both the geography and the brutality of the case could quickly become the focus of institutional hope. In 1993, that hope became action. Pacciani was arrested as the alleged Monster of Florence. It is hard to overstate how significant that was. For the first time, the state was not merely presenting a theory about a missing killer or reviving old lines from the Sardinian Trail. It was moving toward a single living defendant who could, in the prosecutor's view, explain 7 of the 8 double murders. The first 1968 double murder remained legally complicated because of the earlier Stefano Mele proceedings, but the broader series was now being gathered around Pacciani as the central figure. The case against him was never built on one clean forensic masterstroke. That is crucial. The Beretta pistol linked to the killings was still missing. No conclusive physical evidence equivalent to the murder weapon placed him beyond dispute at all the crime scenes. Instead, the breakthrough was prosecutorial rather than purely forensic. Investigators assembled a case from his violent history, witness testimony, search results, behavioral interpretation, and the belief that his life and character matched the structure of the murders. In other words, they believed they had finally found the human answer that fit the known pattern. That kind of breakthrough is always unstable. It feels like revelation because it replaces abstraction with a face, but it also depends heavily on whether the suspect can bear the weight of a long, unsolved story. In Pacciani's case, the fit was powerful enough that a trial moved forward, and in 1994 he was convicted in first instance for 7 of the 8 double homicides and sentenced to life imprisonment. After years of uncertainty, that verdict looked to many like the end of the Monster of Florence mystery. Yet even in that apparent moment of resolution, the case was already beginning to split again. Part of the reason was the continuing weakness of the physical evidence. Another was that the monster crimes had always carried the suspicion that one man might not be enough. The pattern of the murders suggested coherence but not necessarily solitude. Once Pacciani was placed at the center, police and prosecutors increasingly explored the possibility that he had not acted alone. That shift would become one of the most consequential turns in the whole investigation. This is where Giancarlo Lotti and Mario Vanni began moving from the edges of the story toward the middle. Vanni had already appeared around the proceedings as a friend and associate of Pacciani. Later, he would become famous for describing their relationship as that of mere snack buddies, a phrase that entered Italian public memory because it sounded so ordinary against the scale of the crimes. Giancarlo Lotti became even more important when he emerged as a witness whose statements implicated not only Pacciani and Vanni, but also himself. Lotti's role was the real pressure release in the case. Up to that point, Pacciani could still be treated as the singular answer, however contested. Once Lotti started talking, the investigation gained something it had lacked for years: an insider narrative. According to later summaries of the proceedings, Lotti claimed to have seen Pacciani and Vanni commit the 1985 murder, and then, after further questioning, began incriminating himself in multiple murders as well. That did not solve every problem, but it transformed the case from a hunt for one elusive predator into a theory of collaboration. And that was the true break in the investigation. Not just the arrest of Pietro Pacciani, but the shift from pattern to group theory. From the perspective of prosecutors, this change made the case stronger. It helped explain a contradiction that had shadowed the investigation for years: the possibility that the murders involved more than one person, whether for execution, support, or post-crime activity. If Pacciani was the dominant figure, and men like Vanni and Lotti were present as helpers or accomplices, then some of the long-standing uncertainties became easier to narrate. The monster no longer had to be a single, almost supernatural offender. He could be the center of a small criminal circle. But the same development also created new vulnerabilities. Lotti's testimony would later become one of the most debated elements in the case. Its reliability, consistency, and legal meaning were questioned by many observers. Even so, at the moment of breakthrough, prosecutors treated it as decisive movement. They were no longer only matching a suspect to a pattern, they were building a structure in which one suspect's centrality was reinforced by another man's account from inside the alleged group. The timing mattered too. The killings had stopped after 1985, which meant the investigation in the 1990s was not trying to prevent an active murderer from striking again. It was trying to explain the past under intense public scrutiny. That environment changes what a break means. In an active case, a break often points forward to prevention. In the Monster of Florence case, the break pointed backward to interpretation. Prosecutors believed they finally had a framework that could organize 17 years of violence into one intelligible account. To many outside the courtroom, Pacciani also fit because he was easy to imagine as dangerous. His violent past was real. His public image was harsh. He did not look like an innocent man trapped by some subtle misunderstanding. That is not evidence, but it shaped the emotional climate around the case. The breakthrough was not just legal, it was symbolic. Italy's most notorious unnamed killer now seemed to have a body, a history, and associates. At the same time, the missing pieces never disappeared. The murder weapon remained unfound. The 1968 origin case still carried its own complications. The question of whether one offender or several had committed the crimes was now being answered by theory and testimony rather than by a complete forensic chain. The break felt decisive, but it did not erase the old weaknesses. It simply pushed them into a new arena where they would be tested much more publicly. That public testing began immediately after Pacciani's conviction. His 1994 life sentence suggested that the state had, at last, named the monster. But the conviction also ensured that every weakness in the case would now be dragged into appellate scrutiny. If the breakthrough was real, it would survive that pressure. If it was only the most persuasive available story, the pressure would expose it. And then the investigation moved further. Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti were no longer peripheral names. They became the next essential pieces in the prosecutor's model of the crimes. The case was entering a stage where suspicion would have to become architecture. Who did what? Who was present? Which murders each man could be tied to? And how much of the official narrative depended on one another's words? The breakthrough had opened the door. Now the state had to prove it could walk through. For decades, the Monster of Florence had seemed like a pattern without a person. In the 1990s, that changed. Pietro Pacciani's arrest gave prosecutors the figure they believed they needed. Giancarlo Lotti's statements and Mario Vanni's growing significance gave them a possible group structure. At last, the case looked as though it had moved from nightmare into explanation. But explanation is not the same as proof, and proof was about to face a courtroom. Once Pietro Pacciani had been identified as the central suspect, the Monster of Florence investigation entered a different kind of phase. For years, police had been trying to understand a pattern. Now prosecutors had to convert that pattern into a legal structure. That meant separating what could be argued in court from what had only been feared in public, and it meant turning decades of suspicion into something more disciplined. Evidence, timelines, witness testimony, corroboration, and a theory of participation that could survive scrutiny. The first building block of the case was the ballistic continuity. Investigators had tied the core murders together through a .22 caliber Beretta pistol and matching ammunition characteristics, which is why the killings could be treated as a linked series at all. That part was foundational. Without the weapon link, the prosecution would have been left with a string of superficially similar double murders. With it, they could argue continuity across years and scenes. But the same fact also exposed a major weakness. The gun itself was never recovered, so the state could prove linkage between crimes more easily than it could prove possession by a specific defendant. The second building block was behavioral pattern. The victims were generally couples in isolated rural or semi-rural areas around Florence, often in parked cars or otherwise alone in places chosen for privacy. Prosecutors could present that as evidence of a recurring method rather than coincidence. The settings, timing, and attack structure suggested a stable offender logic. Approach at night, exploit isolation, use the same firearm line, and impose control quickly. That did not identify Pietro Pacciani by itself, but it gave the prosecution a clear architecture into which a suspect could later be placed. The third element was Pacciani himself. The case against him did not rest on a single conclusive forensic match. It was built through accumulation. He had a documented history of serious violence, including a prior homicide conviction, and prosecutors treated that past not as proof of the monster murders, but as part of a wider portrait of capability, temperament, and sexualized aggression. In court, that kind of background can be powerful, but it is always dangerous. It can explain why investigators focused on someone. It cannot on its own prove he committed a later series of crimes. Searches of Pacciani's property and the interpretation of items found there also became part of the prosecutorial narrative. At the time, investigators presented some discoveries as incriminating. Later reporting and criticism, however, made clear that at least some of that evidentiary picture was heavily disputed, including the issue of an unfired bullet reportedly found in his garden and later described as planted by police. That matters because it shows how unstable the case could become once it moved from suspicion to proof. What sounded persuasive during the investigation did not always remain strong under later review. So the prosecution needed more than character and contested physical inferences. It needed witnesses. That is where the case changed shape. At first, Pacciani could still be framed as the singular monster, the man who fit the geography and violence well enough to absorb the whole case. But prosecutors increasingly moved toward a group theory. This was not just a dramatic flourish, it solved practical problems. If some of the crimes seemed difficult to explain as the work of one man alone, accomplices could make the prosecution's model more coherent. If the pattern suggested support, lookout behavior, or shared participation, a small group became easier to argue than a completely solitary offender. Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti became crucial because they helped prosecutors transform suspicion into that group structure. Vanni, a postman, had already been associated with Pacciani and later became widely known through the nickname Snack Buddies, which came from his own attempt to describe their relationship in ordinary terms. Lotti mattered even more because he gave statements that implicated not only Pacciani and Vanni, but eventually himself. In legal terms, this was a major shift. The case was no longer only about matching a suspect to a pattern. It now included insider testimony that purported to describe how the murders had been carried out. According to later summaries of the proceedings, Lotti first claimed to have seen Pacciani and Vanni commit the 1985 Scopiti murders. After repeated questioning, he went further and incriminated himself in multiple killings. For prosecutors, that was extraordinarily valuable. It provided narrative detail, linked named men to specific murders, and helped explain why the monster case might have looked coherent while still resisting a lone offender theory. It also gave the state a mechanism for corroboration. If Lotti's account aligned with known case facts, then his statements could be used to reinforce the broader prosecutorial model. But this is where source discipline matters most. Lotti's testimony was central. It was also one of the most contested parts of the entire case. Critics argued that his statements shifted, that he changed versions, and that too much of the later legal narrative depended on a witness whose reliability was deeply uncertain. Even summaries favorable to the official outcome acknowledged that the convictions of the so-called snack buddies were based largely on the testimonies of Lotti and another witness, Pucci. That means the legal case became stronger narratively. At the same moment, it became more vulnerable evidentially. This is the distinction between what was proven, what was argued, and what remained uncertain. What prosecutors argued was that Pacciani stood at the center of the murders and that Vanni and Lotti acted in connection with him in multiple attacks. What the courts did at different stages was more uneven. Pacciani was convicted in first instance in 1994 and sentenced to life imprisonment, which meant the trial court accepted the prosecution's basic case strongly enough to impose the most severe penalty, but that did not settle the matter. On appeal in 1996, Pacciani was acquitted. That appellate outcome is one of the most important facts in the whole case because it demonstrates that the first instance conviction was not the same thing as final legal certainty. The Attorney General himself sought acquittal, citing lack of evidence and poor police work, according to multiple summaries. Italy's Supreme Court later ordered a new trial, but Pacciani died in 1998 before the retrial process could conclude. So the legal record never produced a finished final judgment confirming him as the monster. That is not a minor footnote. It is central to why the case remains disputed. The proceedings involving Vanni and Lotti followed a different path. Both were convicted in first instance in 1998 in connection with several of the murders. In 1999, those convictions were confirmed on appeal, though Lotti's sentence was reduced and aspects of Vanni's penalty were adjusted. In 2000, the Supreme Court of Cassation confirmed the appeal ruling. That means Vanni and Lotti did end up with final convictions tied to multiple murders in the series, unlike Pacciani, whose case remained legally unfinished at the point of his death. Even there, however, the result was not complete closure. Final conviction is one kind of legal solidity, but the broader meaning of those convictions remained contested in journalism, commentary, and among many observers of the case. The murder weapon was still missing. The full motive had not been established with certainty, and the group theory still depended heavily on testimony that many considered unstable. So while the courts ultimately sustained convictions against Vanni and Lotti, the larger question of whether the complete truth had been reached remained open. That is why Chapter 8 is not just about evidence, it is about evidentiary strategy. Prosecutors built the case by layering one type of proof over another. Ballistics established continuity, behavioral pattern established method. Pacciani's background helped justify focus. Witness testimony, especially Lotti's, supplied a theory of named participation. The courts then had to decide whether those layers, taken together, amounted to proof beyond reasonable doubt. Sometimes they said yes, sometimes they said no. It is also why the case exposed the limits of criminal certainty in high-pressure investigations. In a simpler murder case, one contradiction may collapse the prosecution. In a sprawling serial case, contradictions can coexist with conviction if the court finds the overall structure persuasive enough. The Monster of Florence proceedings show exactly that tension. Pieces of the state's theory were accepted, other pieces remained doubtful, and the legal record itself became part of the mystery rather than the end of it. By the end of this phase, the prosecution had done what long unsolved investigations dream of doing. It had turned fear into named defendants, pattern into courtroom narrative, and public obsession into a sequence of judgments. But it had not eliminated uncertainty. It had only contained it well enough in some proceedings to obtain convictions. Now the case was ready to enter its most unstable arena of all, the contested public record of trial, appeal, reversal, and enduring doubt. The law had built a story. Next, that story would be fought over line by line. Once the Monster of Florence case entered the courtroom, the murders stopped being only a series of crime scenes and became a battle over meaning. Prosecutors, defense lawyers, judges, journalists, and the public were no longer asking only what had happened in the Tuscan countryside between 1968 and 1985. They were asking which story could survive legal pressure. Was the state finally naming the real killers, or was it imposing a coherent narrative on a case that had never yielded complete certainty? That divide shaped every major courtroom phase that followed. The prosecution's central claim in the Pacciani era was that Pietro Pacciani was the monster, or at least the dominant figure behind the murders later attributed to him. To make that argument, prosecutors leaned on the recurring pattern of the attacks, the ballistic link tying the core murders together through the same .22 caliber Beretta, Pacciani's violent history, and the interpretation of witness and search evidence gathered around him. In narrative terms, it was a powerful case. It turned years of fear into one identifiable defendant and suggested that the countryside killings could finally be traced back to a single human center. The defense attacked that center directly. Their argument was not simply that Pacciani was harmless or misunderstood. It was that the evidence did not reach the standard required to declare him the Monster of Florence. The murder weapon had never been found. Physical proof tying him conclusively across the crime scenes was missing. Some alleged incriminating evidence was disputed, and the prosecution, in the defense view, had built too much on character, atmosphere, and inference. A man could be violent, crude, feared, and still not be the killer the state wanted him to be. That is what makes the 1994 first-instance conviction of Pacciani so important. The court accepted the prosecution's case strongly enough to sentence him to life imprisonment. For many observers, that looked like the end of the mystery. After decades of panic, the state had a verdict, a sentence, and a named monster. But in a case like this, a first-instance conviction was never the same as a final truth. It was only the first official victory for one version of events. The appeal phase changed everything. In 1996, Pacciani was acquitted. Even more striking, the Attorney General at appeal argued for acquittal, citing lack of evidence and poor police work. That reversal did not just weaken the prosecution's theory, it shattered the appearance that the legal process had settled the case. A man who had been declared the monster by one court was now released by another, and the difference between suspicion and proof became impossible to ignore. In hindsight, that acquittal is one of the most revealing moments in the whole case. It showed how differently the same record could be read. One court saw enough to convict for life, another saw enough doubt to overturn the result. That is not a minor procedural wrinkle. It is the clearest demonstration that the Monster of Florence case was never just about evidence in the narrow sense. It was about interpretation under pressure. The same facts could support opposite legal outcomes, because the story built from those facts was never fully stable. Italy's Supreme Court later ordered a new trial for Pacciani, which meant the acquittal was not the last institutional word either. But Pacciani died in 1998, before that retrial process could be completed. His death froze his place in the record. He remained forever suspended between conviction and acquittal, central to the case yet never definitively resolved within it. That ambiguity has shaped public understanding ever since. He is neither a legally confirmed monster nor a suspect who cleanly disappeared from the story. While Pacciani's position became unstable, the prosecution's broader theory evolved. The state increasingly argued that the murders had not been committed by Pacciani alone. This is where Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti became essential. Vanni had already been associated with Pacciani, and Lotti's later statements gave prosecutors the tool they needed to transform a lone killer narrative into a group theory. That shift was legally strategic. It helped explain why the murders might show coherence without fitting perfectly inside one man's actions alone. Lotti's statements became the heart of this new prosecutorial story. He initially claimed to have seen Pacciani and Vanni commit the 1985 Scopetti murders. Later, after further questioning, he implicated himself in multiple killings as well. For the prosecution, this was the long-awaited insider account. It offered named participants, specific acts, and a way to connect abstract pattern with alleged direct observation. In courtroom terms, that was invaluable. It gave the state a witness who could claim knowledge from inside the crimes rather than from outside reconstruction. But the defense had an obvious line of attack, and it was a serious one. Could Giancarlo Lotti be trusted at all? Later summaries and commentary repeatedly note that the convictions of the so-called snack buddies rested heavily on the testimonies of Lotti and another witness, Pucci, and that Lotti's versions changed over time. That did not automatically make his statements false, but it gave defense lawyers and critics exactly what they needed to argue that the official case remained structurally fragile. If the inside story kept shifting, then the architecture built on it could shift too. This is where the courtroom became a contest between two different ideas of truth. The prosecution argued that messy testimony can still be truthful in substance, especially in a sprawling case involving local fear, shame, and years of silence. The defense argued that a case this grave cannot safely rest on witnesses whose statements evolved under pressure and whose reliability was widely questioned. Both positions had force. That is one reason the public record remains so divided. The legal question was never simply whether Lotti spoke. It was whether his speaking made the story stronger or more dangerous. The verdicts involving Vanni and Lotti gave the prosecution major victories. In 1998, both men were convicted in first instance in connection with multiple murders. In 1999, those convictions were confirmed on appeal, though Lotti's sentence was reduced and aspects of Vanni's penalty were adjusted. In 2000, the Supreme Court of Cassation confirmed the appeal judgment. Formally, that meant the Italian courts did reach final convictions against Vanni and Lotti, tied to several of the monster murders. And yet even those final convictions did not end the deeper divide. For supporters of the official case, they represented the state's best and most durable answer. The murders were carried out by a small group, with Pacciani as the central figure and Vanni and Lotti as accomplices. For critics, the same verdicts proved something more troubling, that a high-pressure case with missing forensics and unreliable testimony had hardened into legal truth without ever truly dissolving its contradictions. The existence of a judgment and the existence of doubt continued side by side. That enduring divide widened further because the broader mythology of the case kept generating alternative stories. Theories involving occult motives, secret commissions, or wider conspiracies circulated for years, sometimes encouraged by later investigative speculation, but those claims were never established in a way that resolved the murders. In court, what mattered most was not mythology, but what could be tied to admissible evidence and named defendants. The problem was that even the courtroom record, stripped of rumor, still did not produce universal confidence. There is also the unresolved issue of the first 1968 murder of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco. Stefano Mele had been convicted in that original case before later ballistic developments linked the same weapon to the wider series. That meant the legal history of the Monster of Florence began with one answer and later evolved into another. It is difficult to think of a clearer example of why the case resisted clean closure. Its origin point was itself unstable. The beginning could not be fully reconciled with the ending. By the end of the courtroom years, the official record had produced both conclusions and fractures. Pacciani had been convicted, acquitted on appeal, and died before retrial. Vanni and Lotti had been convicted in final instance. The Beretta pistol remained missing. The broader motive remained uncertain. Many journalists, legal observers, and even some figures close to the case continued to argue that the complete truth had never been established. That is why the Monster of Florence remains such an unusual legal story. It did not end with a verdict that swallowed doubt. It ended with verdicts that left doubt alive. So if this chapter has a verdict, it is not a simple one. Officially, the courts gave Italy part of an answer. Unofficially, the case kept resisting. The strongest unresolved divide was no longer just who killed the couples around Florence. It was whether the state, after decades of panic and pressure, had truly caught the right men or had only built the most sustainable version of an incomplete truth. The Monster of Florence case did not end the way notorious murder cases are supposed to end. There was no recovered weapon displayed as the final key, no clean confession that aligned every scene, every year, and every contradiction, no single verdict that closed the file in the public imagination. Instead, what remained after the trials, appeals, convictions, reversals, and deaths was something more unsettling, a case that had produced legal outcomes without ever producing full emotional or historical certainty. That is one reason the Monster of Florence still occupies such a distinctive place in Italian criminal memory. People remember the dead, of course. They remember the couples attacked in cars and isolated clearings around Florence. They remember the .22 caliber Beretta that linked the core murders across years. They remember the name itself, which transformed a sequence of rural double homicides into a national and international legend. But they also remember the instability. They remember that the answers kept changing. They remember that one suspect could look central, then uncertain, then central again. They remember that convictions arrived, and doubt did not leave with them. In strict factual terms, the record is already disturbing enough. Between 1968 and 1985, 8 couples were generally linked to the series. The core crimes were tied together through ballistics involving the same .22 caliber Beretta. After decades of investigation, Pietro Pacciani was arrested, convicted in first instance in 1994, acquitted on appeal in 1996, and died in 1998 before a retrial could conclude. Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti were later convicted in connection with multiple murders. Yet even after those proceedings, the murder weapon remained missing, and public debate over the full truth never ended. That gap between legal process and felt certainty is what gives the case its afterlife. Many murder cases remain famous because the killer escaped identification. The Monster of Florence is more complicated. It remained famous even after men were prosecuted and convicted, because the central anxiety was not only whether the state had found someone, it was whether the state had found enough. That is a far more corrosive form of uncertainty. It means the official answer exists, but never quite settles. The case also changed how many people thought about ordinary space. The murders did not happen in some obviously forbidden world. They happened in places associated with privacy, youth, romance, and temporary escape. Cars parked off rural roads, quiet edges of fields, spots where couples expected to be left alone. The monster case permanently altered the meaning of those places in the Florentine imagination. It suggested that solitude could be studied, that vulnerability could be mapped, and that the search for privacy could itself become the thing a killer hunted. That transformation matters culturally because it turned a regional landscape into a psychological one. The hills and roads around Florence are part of one of Europe's most admired environments. But for years, they also became associated with ambush, fear, and the possibility that someone was watching from outside the circle of light. That contrast helped fix the case in public memory. The horror did not arrive in a visibly ruined place. It arrived in a beautiful one. The case also exposed the limits of investigative confidence under pressure. That does not mean every criticism of police or prosecutors was automatically correct. It means the case created a public record in which criticism became unavoidable. When a first-instance conviction is overturned on appeal, when key testimony remains contested, when the original 1968 murder shifts, meaning decades after an initial conviction, and when the weapon at the heart of the case is never found, confidence becomes difficult to restore completely. The investigation may still produce important truths, but it will struggle to produce uncontested authority. That is why the Monster of Florence became more than a serial murder case. It became a case about criminal certainty itself. How much evidence is enough when the pattern is strong, but the physical proof is incomplete? How much weight can a court place on witness testimony that many observers find unstable? How should the public understand a conviction that survives legally but not emotionally? And what happens when a society spends so many years trying to identify a monster that the process of identification becomes part of the story? The answer in this case was that the investigation entered mythology. That word needs care because mythology can blur fact. But in the Monster of Florence case, mythology does not only mean rumor or fantasy. It means the way a real case accumulates symbolic power beyond the courtroom. The name itself helped create that effect. The Monster of Florence was not just a descriptive label, it was a narrative force. It gathered separate murder scenes into one figure, gave the press a way to speak about terror as if it had one body, and turned the investigation into an ongoing moral drama between hidden predation and public understanding. Once a case reaches that level, it becomes vulnerable to everything that feeds myth. Speculation expands, theories multiply. Later, writers, filmmakers, investigators, and journalists return to the material not only because of what is known, but because of what is not. In the Monster case, that has included theories about accomplices, local networks, sexual pathology, investigative tunnel vision, and much more extreme claims involving secret societies or ritual motives. Those more sensational claims were never established as fact, but their persistence tells its own story. When a case never fully closes, people keep trying to build structures large enough to contain its mystery. The historical importance of the case also lies in the way it sits between eras. The early murders belonged to a different Italy from the later trials. The 1968 killing of Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco first entered the system as a local crime with intimate social explanations. By the 1980s, the case had become a national fear shaped by mass media, forensic linkage, and serial murder language. By the 1990s, it had become a courtroom spectacle and a crisis of interpretation. And after 2000, it became a permanent subject of documentaries, books, arguments, and unresolved public memory. Few cases show that kind of evolution so clearly. The victims themselves can sometimes be overshadowed by that larger machinery. That is one of the dangers of famous unsolved or disputed cases. The dead risk being reorganized into symbols. But the case begins and ends with real people whose private moments were turned into scenes of violence. Barbara Lotti and Antonio Lobianco, Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini, Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Morio. The argument over the monster's identity does not reduce the force of what happened to them. If anything, the uncertainty sharpens it. It sharpens it because unresolved cases place an additional burden on memory. In a fully solved murder, grief and horror are joined by conclusion. In the Monster of Florence case, conclusion remained uneven. Some families and observers received official answers. Others received only partial belief in those answers. The result is a story that keeps reopening itself. The dead remain fixed in time. The meaning of their deaths does not. There is also the problem of scale. A single unsolved double murder is already devastating. A sequence of linked murders spread across 17 years creates a different kind of national wound. It forces a public to ask whether the killer could have been stopped earlier, whether earlier assumptions blocked later understanding, and whether institutional answers arrived only after too much damage had already been done. The Monster of Florence case continues to provoke those questions precisely because the investigation stretched across so many years and so many phases of apparent progress. And then there is the missing Beretta. The absence of that gun became one of the case's defining facts because it stands for everything investigators could connect but never fully possess. They could describe the weapon, they could link scenes through it, they could make it central to the story, but they could not produce it. In practical terms, that absence limited the case. Symbolically, it became something even larger. It represented the unreachable core of the whole investigation, the object that seemed to promise final certainty and never arrived. That is part of why the central question from the beginning still survives. Back in Chapter 1, the unsettling question was whether the real killer was ever truly identified, or whether the investigation locked onto incomplete answers while something larger remained hidden. After all the trials and all the years, that question still cannot be dismissed as mere dramatic phrasing. It remains the sober, factual problem at the heart of the case. One can say certain things with confidence. The murders were real. The ballistic link across the core series was real. The legal proceedings against Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti were real. The convictions of Vanni and Lotti are part of the final judicial record. The acquittal of Pacciani on appeal and his death before retrial are also part of that record. The murder weapon was never recovered. The broader motive was never firmly established. Public doubt persisted, but confidence stops there. And that stopping point is what makes the Monster of Florence endure. It endures because the case resists the comforting illusion that time always clarifies. Sometimes time produces more records, more judgments, and more arguments without producing a final shape everyone can live inside. Sometimes a case becomes more documented and less settled at the same time. That was the fate of the Monster investigation. It did not vanish into silence. It remained visible, studied, litigated, and narrated. Yet the deeper certainty people wanted kept slipping away. For Italy, the case became a warning about what happens when serial violence meets fragmented proof and public pressure. For journalists, it became a test of how to write about horror without overstating certainty. For courts, it became an example of how verdicts can conclude proceedings without erasing historical dispute. And for the broader public, it became one of those rare criminal stories that keeps its power not because nothing was ever found, but because what was found never fully held. That may be the most disturbing conclusion of all. Not that the Monster of Florence was invisible, but that, even after decades of scrutiny, the truth may have remained only partly visible the entire time. Thank you for spending this time with SnoozeCrime. The Monster of Florence remains one of those cases that does not settle, even after years of investigation, arrests, and courtroom decisions. Not only because of the violence, but because certainty never fully arrived. Couples were killed across the countryside around Florence. Investigators connected the crimes through the same weapon. Men were accused, some were convicted, and still, the full shape of the truth remained disputed. That is what gives this case its lasting weight. It is not simply the story of a killer in the dark. It is also the story of what happens when a case becomes bigger than any single answer. When evidence points in one direction, doubt survives in another, and official conclusions never completely silence the questions left behind. The victims were real. The fear was real. The legal record is real. But the unease never left. Because some cases are remembered not only for what was done, but for how incomplete the ending still feels. This is SnoozeCrime. Real cases, told slowly. Sleep. Reflect. Return.